Hi everyone, welcome back to another video, and we are continuing our series and kind of concluding our series on vampires, and we're actually going to shift our attention towards werewolves in the next few videos, but we're going to talk today about rabies virus, which actually might be a common origin for both vampire and werewolf myths. If you've heard anything about either of these myths, there is some overlap. And rabies virus is a very good potential explanation for both of them. So we're going to talk about it today as we direct our attention more towards werewolves in the next few weeks. So here we have rabies virus, and it belongs to the family of Rhabdoviridae, rhabdo referring to muscle. The genus is lyssavirus, and lyssavirus is a category of viruses that all act very similarly. Many of them are just named after either different animal vectors or they're named after different locations in the world, but they all have very similar signs and symptoms, very similar methods of transmission. So all of them could potentially be related to these myths, but rabies virus by far is the most common and most well-known, so we're going to specifically address this one. It is a negative sense single-stranded RNA virus, and what this means is that the RNA produced by rabies virus is complementary to the DNA or the RNA needed to make proteins right away. So if something is positive sense, it's already ready to go. It can just be translated into protein as soon as it enters the cell. But this negative sense RNA cannot do that. So it's going to need to be switched. So it's going to need to become the proper reading strand of RNA before it can become protein. So there's an extra step. It has to use extra cell machinery to make this possible. That's not super important for the myths, but for those of you who love studying viruses, here's just some extra information for you to know. So rabies virus, many of you may know that a lot of times people may catch rabies by animal bites. You can also get it from human bites. So we're going to talk about how exactly you get infected with rabies and what it does throughout your body. So let's say we have a person who is bit by this cute little bat drawing I have. So we have a bat and it bites a human on the arm or wherever the bat's going to bite them. Multiple reservoir mechanisms, animals that you would see. We have bats, we have dogs, wolves, really any kind of animal that could contract this virus could infect a human. And as I said, a human bite of someone who already is infected with rabies could also do this. So right off the bat here, we have bats. We know those are related to vampire myths. We know dogs and wolves are related to werewolf myths. Even wolves are also related to vampire myths. So you have these animals that then bite a human. They end up getting symptomatic. People freak out because they start having these symptoms. They start seeming not like themselves. They start seeming more beast-like. And you can see where they would, of course, associate this new disease state with this animal bite that they received or this human bite that they received. So you have this bat or whatever animal that bites a human, and then inside that human, the virus is going to replicate, and it's going to invade the peripheral nerves, and it's going to travel via retrograde transport. So it's going to travel backwards towards the spinal cord. So it's going to travel up through the peripheral nerves into the dorsal root ganglion, and this is specifically the sensory side of the pathway going to the spinal cord. So we'll see that you have some sensory symptoms, some sensory issues, because it's primarily going to invade this dorsal root ganglion. And you'll see some motor symptoms as well, because we have the virus in the muscle tissue, and some of it probably will enter motor fibers as well, more peripherally. But we have it going into the dorsal root ganglion, and then from there, it's going to travel into the spinal cord and then all the way up to the brain, and in the brain, it's going to affect multiple regions, and the regions it affects can be variable from person to person, but for some examples that relate to the vampire myths and werewolf myths specifically, we have the hypothalamus is invaded, we have the hippocampus that can become infected, the cerebellum, and the brainstem, and all of these are going to lead to certain symptoms. So the hypothalamus can relate to some emotional function, as well as the hippocampus, both related to the limbic system. You have responses to temperature, you have responses to autonomic stimuli. So the hypothalamus especially is very responsible for autonomic function. You have the cerebellum responsible in balance and other such proprioception kind of equilibrium regulation. You have some brainstem activity that's going to be affected, and we're going to see a lot of cranial nerve effects in the brainstem, such as the eyes. Muscles for swallowing are affected in the brainstem, and muscles for breathing are controlled in the brainstem as well. So we're going to see effects of these specific regions from the rabies virus that is going to invade this neural tissue. So talking about the phases of rabies, so we start off with the incubation phase, which is going to be pretty variable. Sometimes you might start, so you get bit by whatever it is that's infecting you, and it could be either days, so very, very quick after the bite, or it could even be years later before you start seeing symptoms. So, of course, with the people that are infected and then have symptoms a few days later, it's pretty easy to trace back these symptoms to the animal bite. However, somebody who goes 8 years, 10 years down the road without seeing symptoms, there might be some more room for speculation about what happened to them that made them become that way. And I'm not sure exactly what went through these people's minds with people who had years post-exposure before symptoms. But there's a lot of room, especially if you aren't sure what's going on. And I could imagine it'd be very scary for this society to have people just come up with these symptoms out of nowhere. But after incubation phase, so once the virus has started causing symptoms, it's pretty rare that someone is going to survive. I think that without treatment, only 6 people in the entire world have recovered from rabies, so it's pretty lethal. And once you start having symptoms, it's almost inevitable that you are going to die from it, just based on symptomology and what happens to your body because of this virus. So the prodrome is kind of the initial phase of the symptoms that you get. So you start seeing this like from days to a week after exposure, usually, or at least after the incubation period. And you start getting some, so it lasts for about days to a week. And so you have this constitutional symptoms, which are fever, you can have sore throat, you can have some inflamed lymph nodes, just kind of these general, like, muscle aches. It's kind of these general symptoms that you'd associate with the flu or a cold, kind of these, you can't really place them specifically to a specific disease, but you know that you have an infection. So then the next thing, you have hyperesthesia. So you can have some increased pain or increased responses to certain stimuli. You're just feeling things more intensely through your nervous system, which would make sense because you have nervous system involvement. You could also have paresthesia, which is numbness and tingling in your extremities. Paresthesia is often seen with radiculopathies or neuropathies, seen in certain spinal cord injuries. You get paresthesia. So, of course, with the nervous system involvement, we start seeing paresthesia. One of the first symptoms you probably see is this numbness and tingling in the extremities. You can also get something called percussion myoedema, and this is really interesting, actually. So if you were to percuss, so if you were to tap on somebody's muscle, it might just kind of swell up, and that's myoedema. And that's something you don't see with a whole lot of conditions, so that's kind of unique here to rabies. You also get excessive salivation and lacrimation. You can get, and that's also too from kind of altered autonomic activity because your salivation and lacrimation are often related to the parasympathetic nervous system. If you have your nervous system that can't regulate itself, especially when you're supposed to either determine fight or flight responses or feed and breed kind of situations, your body can't recognize the difference between those situations. So you might have inappropriate levels of salivation or lacrimation because you can't shut those pathways off. You can also have increased muscle tone. You can also, because the muscle tone thing is going to come from this, again, instability. You're going to get muscle tension because it's going to contract, muscle contraction due to nervous system stimulation. You can have exaggerated facial expressions due to, number one, emotional response pathways being affected. So number one, being more responsive to emotional stimuli that might give somebody increased reactivity in their facial expressions, but you also might get some muscle tension in the face that keeps the face locked in certain emotional states of appearance. You also get mydriasis, which is going to be dilation of the pupils, so continually dilated. And this is kind of the prodrome. So when you start seeing this list of symptoms, you're thinking it's early stage of disease, but with a few of these, you can pretty quickly tell that this is rabies and it's not going to end well for this person. So hopefully you can get treatment before this stage even, but once you start reaching this, it's really hard to go back. So what happens then in the end stage of disease? This is kind of where we get some more of these typical vampire and werewolf symptoms. Of course, we had a few on this prodrome list, such as the salivation and lacrimation, the facial expressions. Those things do kind of play into the myth, but especially here with this end stage. So we have the excitation phase, which comes next. And one type of response to this is one we're not going to talk about a whole lot, because you can have two different types of the excitation phase of rabies. The first type is the paralytic type, which kind of presents like a Guillain-Barré or like a paralysis starting from the legs and migrating upward. That's not really going to present very similarly to vampires or werewolves, so I just mentioned it here because it is a presentation, but we're going to focus on the encephalitic type. So encephalitis is inflammation of the brain, and this is extremely problematic, and this is why those brain regions we talked about a minute ago are going to be really important. So one of the most extreme symptoms of encephalitic rabies is hydrophobia, and this is a very extreme reaction to water. And how this happens is you have someone who is trying to drink water, and due to infiltration of the medulla and the control of muscles that help you swallow, the pharyngeal muscles, so the muscles in your throat, are going to spasm, and you can't swallow any of the water. So you keep trying this, and each time you try to drink water, you can't do it, and you might start to choke on it. And this, of course, can cause you to have a reaction the next time you try to drink water. You are primed in your mind now to know anytime I try to drink water, I'm going to choke on it, and it's going to hurt. So these people at the sight of water, or even at talk of water, or trying to swallow water, can cause this very extreme fear and paranoia reaction on top of the neurologic spasm reaction that they get when they have the water. And then it's kind of similarly with aerophobia, where just like in the same mechanism as hydrophobia, you have air. So if they're trying to breathe, or if they breathe too hard, you trigger this same spasm. And thoughts of air, thoughts of wind can also trigger these spasms. So think about this. You have people who can't swallow water. They can't really breathe air without spasming. They're probably, number one, going to be very dehydrated. Their electrolytes are going to be out of balance. You're also going to have inability to breathe, and this can be fatal. This is where we get a lot of death in this excitation phase of rabies. You also, as I mentioned kind of before, you get autonomic instability, carries over from this excessive salivation, lacrimation, also muscle tone. Some of these things, the mydriasis, also all results from autonomic instability, but further dysregulation, you start getting, increased muscle tone, you start salivating, you start sweating inappropriately, you start spending a lot of energy in your body because you might think that there's an emergency, but there isn't, so you get more panic responses, all kinds of autonomic instability that you see in this stage as well, probably more extreme at this point than we saw in the prodrome. You also, with the invasion of the hippocampus and the hypothalamus, and if, in some cases, if you have the amygdala involved as well, you can get aggression, extreme aggression, and hypersexuality. So you get this presentation that's almost like a beast-like state, because you have people who are hyper-aggressive. They're going to start violence more easily. They're going to react more severely and more angrily to maybe more benign stimuli. You're going to have hypersexuality. And then you are also going to have, kind of going along with the hydro and aerophobia, you have cranial nerve palsies. So diplopia, so double vision, is going to happen when the nerves to eye muscles don't work, especially, and if you have problems with the optic nerve. So you get some issues with cranial nerves in the eyes, you get issues with cranial nerves in the ears, so you get some vertigo, with cranial nerve 8 activity, dysphagia, so you can't swallow. That's going to go along with cranial nerves 9 and 10. And strabismus is going to come from extraocular eye muscle involvement. So nerves 3, 4, and 6 are going to cause the eyes to move in different positions or be locked in different positions and make it difficult to move the eyes. So just some examples of what happens with this rabies virus. And we're going to talk next about how this carries over into the myth. So now you have a good understanding of what rabies does, but how does this relate to vampires and werewolves? And which one is more related versus the other, or are they equally inspired by this, or how can we think of this? And there's a few other symptoms as well involved with vampirism and lycanthropy that we are going to mention in this next segment that we didn't really talk about, but we'll explain why they make sense here with rabies, as opposed to some of these did not really line up with porphyria, but they do line up with rabies. So thinking of some of these examples and how it might present like a vampire. If you have somebody who is presenting with these symptoms, especially after a bite from a bat or a wolf, we have this being consistent with vampire mythology. Bats and wolves often were known forms, polymorphs of the vampires. So it could be believed that if you were bitten by a bat or a wolf, that you would get vampirism, but they might actually be getting rabies. Can also be transmitted by a human bite. So if you have somebody who you believe to be a vampire that ends up biting you, and then you catch rabies as well, that could be evidence of being turned into a vampire. And then something else with the hydrophobia. So you have people who cannot drink water, and through that they are becoming paranoid and afraid of water exposure. So in the vampire myths, we have a fear or a susceptibility to holy water. And this could potentially be related to hydrophobia, because if you're paranoid of water, well, holy water is water. So it might not be the fact that it is holy, but the fact that they can't swallow water and they are afraid that that exposure to water is going to kill them. So that makes sense here. We also have garlic sensitivity in vampirism, which, relating back to the hyper responsiveness to stimuli, you have a very strong odor that comes from garlic. If you have somebody that can't appropriately regulate their emotions or can't regulate their response to external stimuli, you could have somebody who lashes out or becomes violent at the smell of garlic. They don't know what to do with that information in their brain, so they might become violent over it. You have mirror sensitivity, same thing. You walk in front of a mirror, you see somebody that looks like you. And not understanding how to process that information, and having very severe paranoia and responses to this stimulus, you might become agitated at the sight of your own reflection. So again, aggression is a symptom of this. And then hypersexuality, we see in a lot of vampire myths. A common trope is vampires wanting to use their powers to seduce other people. So you see that hypersexuality in rabies can translate to vampires wanting to steal people from the town and having sexual activity with them, especially in terms of very aggressive sexual activity. This relates to that as well. So looking at the other side, what does lycanthropy have that rabies also does? And is this different than the things that would inspire vampirism? So we have kind of similarly, we have zoonoses. In this case, not so much the bat, but we have wolves and dogs spreading this virus. If you were bitten by a dog, bitten by a wolf, and then you started exhibiting beast-like behavior, they might suspect that you were a werewolf, or at least transforming into a werewolf. And again, we have human bite transmission in both myths. You have humans that have this paranormal form, and if they bite you, you will also get the same disease. So if a werewolf bites you that has rabies, you will probably also get rabies. And we have drooling, so hypersalivation, and a lot of people may describe that as foaming of the mouth, and that is going to be related to autonomic instability. So that is seen here in rabies and is also directly related to lycanthropy and those myths. You have extreme thirst related to the hydrophobia. In this case, if you can't drink water, of course, you're going to be very thirsty pretty much all of the time. So you have in a lot of werewolf myths, people describing werewolves as one of the initial signs of lycanthropy being extremely thirsty. You see that with rabies. You have, again, this beast-like aggression. You have somebody who presented like a normal human for most of their lives. They were bit by a dog, and now suddenly their cognitive faculties are no longer where they were. They're overly responsive to stimuli. They are violent towards other people. They seem to be in a beast-like trance. And this is definitely relating to rabies in this case. We have a very slow onset. In the werewolf myths, you often hear of the werewolves transforming at the full moon, or they're in their human form most of the time, and they're becoming a werewolf, or they switch over to their werewolf state. And so this might relate to the incredibly slow, the slow period of, as we saw before, of incubation, days to years post-exposure. So you could be bit by a wolf and several years later have your werewolf transformation, or you're not seeing these symptoms right away. So if somebody was believed to run off and then get these symptoms many years later, we have that kind of transition happening. We also have some interesting beliefs with the werewolf myths. Even people who still currently to this day believe in werewolves believe that when a werewolf is in their human form, they have muscle weakness or nervous system weakness compared to their werewolf form. So maybe their energy is depleted from being in this wolf state, and then they go back to their human form. They're still werewolves, but in their human form. And with this nervous system weakened by these paresthesias, by this paralysis, increased muscle tone, you might think that somebody is in their human form and not their werewolf form. And why is this person acting this way? Oh, they're a werewolf, but they're just in their human form, so they're not as strong as they usually are. This might relate to if someone has a wave of aggression and then isn't as aggressive for a certain period of time, switching between their two forms. And of course, a lot of this is speculation. We have plenty of differences in the werewolf and vampire stories throughout history, and depending on the cultures that they come from, but a lot of these are very similar across cultures. And as I mentioned before, lyssaviruses are common globally, and they might present with different names, slightly different structures in the virus themselves, but a lot of this is global, and a lot of these symptoms overlap. So let me know in the comments what you think. Does rabies indicate more vampirism? Does it indicate more lycanthropy? Or are they both equally stemmed from this disease, do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching this video. Next time we're going to talk more about werewolves and hypertrichosis, and I will see you all in the next one.